Welcome to a new episode of Dysphagia Matters. Today we speak to James Borders. He's a speech pathologist and doctoral student in the Laboratory for the Study of Upper Airway Dysfunction at Columbia University in New York. In his research, he focuses on the rehabilitation of impairments in airway protection, namely cough and swallowing dysfunction, to improve health outcomes and quality of life. But apart from that, James is also interested in meta-science, statistics, and how these practices affect the transparency, rigor, and replicability of science. James joined us for this episode to talk about open science. It's really great to have you on today's episode.
Yeah, definitely. Well, first, thanks for having me. Excited to talk about this.
We'll jump right in and start with our first question. Which challenges in science made you start thinking about open science and also researching this topic?
It's kind of been one of those side interests that have kind of developed over time. And I guess I kind of want to preface it by saying that, at least acknowledging that I'm certainly not an expert on open science by any means, or even like meta science. And I'm definitely still learning and trying to figure out how we can apply some of these practices to our field of dysphagia. So kind of to start, I think it's helpful to talk about what is open science and kind of how did this all come about and the history of it. So I think this all started about 10 or 15 years ago when researchers in the field of psychology were noticing that a lot of seminal findings were difficult or impossible to replicate. And when I say replicate, I just mean that when they performed a study again with the exact same methods, the results were different from the original study. So there are a lot of different reasons why this could happen. So things like low statistical power, the file drawer problem, where researchers aren't incentivized to publish negative findings, things like questionable research practices, and even outright fraud. So making up data, essentially. So this obviously really shook the field of psychology. And because of this, many scholars proposed different ways that scientists could make their research more transparent and reproducible, and hopefully also improve its rigor and quality. So open science is really an umbrella term for any practice that promotes transparency in the research process. And there's many tenets and practices that have been proposed, and it kind of depends on who you ask. I think the most popular ones include pre-registering your methods and analysis plan, registered reports, sharing data, and providing a free and legal version of your manuscript through things like preprints or self-archiving. But there really isn't one easy definition of open science. I actually think it evolves over time as we learn more about how to perform really high quality science and adopt different technologies and conventions that kind of help us guide our scientific practice. So that's a very long rant on what is open science. It's actually a difficult question. And so I think kind of learning about open science and seeing other fields kind of grapple with this. Actually, I got my undergraduate degree in psychology, so it's kind of right around when this was being discussed in methods courses and statistics. And so I think kind of understanding that this isn't really isolated to one field of psychology, they're just kind of one of the first fields to really recognize this. And they also are dealing with something that is difficult constructs to measure, behavioral tasks. So there's a lot of room for error. And so I think it does nicely apply to our field of dysphagia and even speech pathology as a whole. And we can really learn a lot from what they've gone through over the past decade and kind of apply it to our science today.
Okay, thank you. So you said that in psychology, they saw that they have specific problems within their science. Are they also the same problems we have in science for speech and language therapy and dysphagia?
It's a difficult question, but a good one. I think that they've gone through the growing pains of recognizing and trying to replicate studies. I think that we're probably in the earlier phase of understanding whether our studies replicate. Certainly replication studies are performed. But I think that at this point, it's kind of hard to know what open science practices could really enhance certain situations. But I think if I were to hypothesize, essentially, I think that we do have some of the issues that they've experienced, because there's so much overlap between our fields in terms of measurements and everything like that. So,
Okay. And why do you think it is important for speech and language therapists or clinicians that open science becomes more of a thing?
Yeah, so there's been a push in our field for speech pathologists to adopt evidence-based practice, which means that we make a concerted effort to incorporate 3 pillars into our clinical practice. So the first pillar is our clinical experience and expert opinion. The second pillar is the client or caregiver's perspective, priorities, and values. And then the third pillar is incorporating the best available evidence from the scientific literature. So in that respect, we want to have accurate and reliable research. It's really a critical part of that last pillar. If our research doesn't replicate and is not of the highest quality, then we're really doing our patients a huge disservice and not providing the best care. I also think since open science promotes transparency and replication, that could help clinicians better understand the methods of a study or even replicate a new treatment that the study describes for their own clinical practice. So certainly a lot of potential benefits of open science for clinical practice and speech pathology. And I think we're really just at the tip of the iceberg at this point.
And what about researchers?
Yeah, so in terms of research, I want to first take a step back and emphasize that using one or more open science practice in research is not necessarily an indicator of quality or rigor. This is a really common misconception of open science. Instead, I think open science really just tries to promote transparency and openness in the research process. With that being said, though, the hope is that by being more transparent, the rigor and reproducibility of a study will improve. So for speech pathology researchers, I think there's 2 types of benefits. There's benefit for the individual researcher or group of researchers that are performing the study, and there's benefit for the scientific community at large. So for the individual researcher, using open science practices can help safeguard against things like questionable research practices or conscious or unconscious biases. So questionable research practices are essentially any practice that the researcher can do to spuriously increase the likelihood of finding evidence in support of their hypothesis. These can include things like excluding a subgroup of patients after analyzing the data so that you get statistical significance, not reporting all dependent variables that were analyzed, reporting an unexpected finding as something that was initially hypothesized when it actually wasn't, or even something like rounding a p-value from 0.054 to less than 0.05. So I think we can all agree that these kind of research practices are highly questionable and certainly affect a study's validity. Some open science practices, like providing a pre-registered time-stamped report of your analysis plan before looking at your data, can help minimize these questionable practices. So in that respect, it can be beneficial for the individual researcher, right? For the scientific community at large, I think that open science facilitates a more transparent body of research for the field. So this really makes our collective goal of trying to find the truth easier for everyone. And almost more importantly, it fosters trust and credibility in our findings, which is crucial. So the benefits obviously depend on the open science practice that we're discussing. And open science doesn't require that a study use every single practice. There's certainly situations where it may be appropriate or may not be appropriate. One benefit for the scientific community that does come to mind that I think is a great example is open data. So our current model of science is you run a study, write the manuscript, and report the results in a textual format. And then if we want to perform a meta-analysis of a couple different studies, we have to extract data from what the researchers reported. So anyone who's ever tried to do a meta-analysis can attest that the data that you need is rarely, if ever, reported in a study. And it's also very difficult, if not impossible, to get the raw data from the authors, right? And that's not necessarily anyone's fault, except that our current model of science clearly has flaws in that respect. So if we decided as a subfield that once we publish a study, we would also provide the raw data needed to replicate it once it's published, then performing a meta-analysis would not only be easier, but also more rigorous, right? And I think it would also help expedite scientific discoveries. So instead of having data essentially lost in the ether once a study is published, it would be available to the public. There's also arguments that studies that are funded by the NIH are funded by taxpayers, and that data should be made available to everyone. So obviously with open data, there are issues surrounding privacy and patient confidentiality that we definitely should consider, but the benefits to our scientific field as a whole are pretty compelling, in my opinion. So that's just one example of kind of how an open science practice could benefit our community at large.
Yeah, thanks so much for outlining and for providing so many good examples. And I just had to remember, like, even if you only quote unquote do a scoping review, a systematic review, you collect the data, you extract it from all the articles that you include, and then you usually focus just on one specific question, but you could do so much more with the data. But of course, in terms of time and oftentimes money, you can't do more. But then if the data would be available, open for anyone, and yeah, anyone could use it and could save so much time and then as well money. So yeah, it sounds pretty easy, but yeah, it probably isn't.
That's a great point about, just to kind of build off that, systematic reviews and meta-analyses, in my opinion, are kind of the easiest entry point into open science. I've done a few systematic reviews where we were able to actually publish the data and the code. And I think that since there's not really privacy concerns there, right? The data, the studies are already out there. It really makes it easier for the next person to come along, say 2 or 3 years later, and they know that 5 or 6 studies have been published. So they don't need to redo everything that you've done before. So in that respect, we can move things along faster and don't have to replicate our efforts, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So you've just uploaded recently a preprint of your manuscript that is currently under review. It's called Open Science Practices in Communication Sciences and Disorders, a Survey. And in this study, you surveyed the knowledge, implementation, and perceived benefits and barriers of open science practices in communication science disorders in the US. But before we start discussing what you found out, we would like to highlight the 4 core open science practices that you have defined for the purpose of your study. And you've already mentioned at least some of them. So these 4 core practices are pre-registration, self-archiving, gold open access, and open data. Could you maybe explain what you understand by these core practices and in which way they are important for open science?
Yeah, definitely. And like I said before, the term core, quote unquote, was really something that we just kind of looked into and saw what we thought were the most common and maybe more applicable to our field. But there's certainly others that I'm sure we did not include. One that comes to mind that I can mention at the end is registered reports. So that's another one. So we'll say 5 for now. But yeah, let's start with pre-registration. So pre-registration is a time-stamped document that requires researchers to specify their hypotheses, methods, and analyses prior to collecting data or analyzing that data. So this document is made available to readers so that they can identify discrepancies between the original plan and the published study. And the main benefit is that as a researcher, you can be very explicit and transparent about what was planned and predicted before starting the study, which, like I said before, can prevent or at least kind of reduce questionable research practices. There are also some practical benefits, like specifying things beforehand allows you to distinguish between confirmatory versus exploratory aims, specify optional stopping rules for data collection, or even use one-tailed tests to optimize power. So again, just because a study is pre-registered doesn't mean it's of higher quality. It just means that there's potentially some more transparency about what was done.
How can we then actually pre-register our study? What would you recommend?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways. The most common and probably the easiest way in my experience has been to use protocols from the Open Science Framework. I think it's osf.io is the website. They have different kind of templates for various study designs. They're quantitative, qualitative, RCTs, observational. And so what we did for this survey study is before we collected the data and as we were designing the survey, we answered all of their questions and also added other questions that we thought were applicable to our design, and then uploaded that document to a project page that we made for the study. And that is timestamped. So it said, this was the date that we uploaded this. And then we sent out the survey, collected the responses. And actually, as we were going through and analyzing the data, we realized, well, maybe we want to add another exploratory aim, something that's a little more qualitative, because everything we had before then was more quantitative. And so all we had to do was go into that OSF page and update it and be transparent about what we changed. And then importantly, the time stamp for the document reflects that we changed it. And we say, look, the data was already collected. We're calling this an exploratory aim. And this is X, Y, and Z, what it is. So it's actually pretty easy and can be applied to a lot of different study designs. With that being said, like I said before, it requires a lot of planning. And people sometimes feel like they're stuck in the analysis that they decide. But I think it's just about transparency. As long as you go in and you say, look, we initially said we were going to use this statistical model. But when we looked at the data, we looked at the distribution, we ran into these errors, we had this missing data. And then because of that, this is our justification for changing it. That's a lot more transparent than we ran this, we didn't find anything statistically significant. Maybe we want to change something, let's exclude this group.
Yeah, just because you pre-register your study doesn't mean you can't change anything. You just have to give reasons why and what you changed.
Exactly. So it's just all about transparency.
Yeah, great. So what about self-archiving then?
Yeah, so kind of gold open access and self-archiving are the two terms we'll use here. So let's just do a hypothetical scenario. Let's say you're a researcher who just spent all this time and money to conduct a study, and you want to publish it in the prestigious journal Nature. So you send it to the journal, they recruit experts in the field to review the paper, and then fortunately, it's accepted. So now if you want anyone to be able to read the article without a subscription, Nature is going to require you to pay, I think for them, more than $11,000.
For one paper?
For one paper, that's right.
Wow.
We all just have that sitting around, yeah?
Yes, definitely.
So we call this process of paying the publisher to make the manuscript accessible to everyone gold open access. On the other hand, there's green open access, also called self-archiving. That's when authors post a free and legal version of their accepted manuscript online, maybe their personal website or a preprint server, and they just make sure that they adhere to publisher guidelines. Essentially, you have to make sure you give them credit and essentially provide a DOI or reference pointing people to the final version.
Depending on the journal, usually there are different types of your manuscript that you are allowed to publish, right?
Yeah, exactly. For the most part, I mean, we found that most journals can accommodate this and will allow you to post essentially the version that went through peer review, but has just not been typeset with the fancy formats from the journal.
Okay.
So self-archiving is nice because it doesn't require you to pay the publisher, and it allows readers to have open access to your research at no cost to you. So the obvious benefit is that your research can be read by anyone, and they don't need a subscription to the journal. So I guess the question is, why would researchers pay so much money to the publisher when you can self-archive for free? And I really think that a lot of people just aren't aware that you can self-archive and really don't know how. And there's certainly situations where you have money from a grant or under the NIH, there's a period of time that you can eventually have it deposited in PMC. So certainly exceptions, but I think for the most part, if we kind of want to escape from the chains of these for-profit publishers, self-archiving is a nice way to go around this in a free and legal way. There's also lots of plugins like unpaywalled, I think is what it's called. And those are nice. They just kind of help you find stuff. Yeah. But I always tell people, if you don't have access, never pay for it. There's no reason to spend $40 for a research article when you can email the author, and 99% of the time, as long as that email still works, they'll be happy to give you the article.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
I have another question as well. So what do you think about websites like Sci-Hub or stuff like that in terms of open access?
Yeah, that is a really great question. Personally, I think that science should be accessible and free for everyone. Obviously, if we can do that in a legal means, then that is the way to go. So self-archiving kind of trumps that in that respect. However, personally, I do admire what the creator of Sci-Hub is doing. And there are different arguments that the legalities may be questionable. So there's kind of tiers to it. Personally, I've never used Sci-Hub.
Of course not.
I have never, yes, no, of course not. But I can understand if people want to use it. So in terms of the researcher, though, self-archiving is a really nice way to just have your research out there and be able to point people to something that's free and legal. Good question, though. That's such a tough question.
Yeah, so we might go on then with open data.
Yeah, so open data involves publicly sharing de-identified research data, or even it can encompass other research materials like code or stimuli needed to replicate the experiment. Typically, data is uploaded to online repositories where it's accessible to the public once a study is published or even under peer review. So researchers actually have an ethical obligation to follow what we call the FAIR data principles, which stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So the main benefit of open data is that it makes research fully transparent and reproducible, right? When you have an open data set, you can directly replicate the analyses and even extend those findings in a meta or a secondary analysis. So for our specific field of dysphagia, I think there's a lot of great potential here that we really haven't tapped into. And one example, there's been a lot of great conversations recently about how to statistically analyze some of our outcomes. And I think as science progresses and statistics progresses, we're going to continue to learn about the best way to analyze data. And arguably, there isn't one best way. Maybe there's multiple ways depending on your goals, et cetera. So the current problem is that we can't reanalyze data that's already been published, and it isn't when it's not publicly accessible. So you'll often read these systematic reviews where the authors throw their hands up in the air and say, I can't meta-analyze this. I can't even draw conclusions or compare things between these studies because different statistics were used. And I think that's a very valid thing to say, but it's incredibly frustrating when there's so much time and effort that's gone into collecting this really high quality data across different populations or even the same populations, and we can't answer our questions. But the problem is that it's a consequence of our system and the current model we have in science. So if we had open data, this really wouldn't be an issue, right? We would be able to go in and make some changes and understand if the results are robust to these different choices in statistics, as one example. So I think that this is something that definitely warrants discussion. and could certainly be beneficial for our field as we're kind of grappling with issues like statistics, or even kind of what you analyze, at what level you analyze, if it's at kind of the bolus level, the researcher level, if we're accounting for kind of the nested components of our data.
Yeah, great. You have mentioned then in the very beginning the fifth core practice, so the registered reports. Can you maybe explain what that is?
Yeah, so typically researchers will design a study, collect the data, write up the results, and then submit it to peer review at a journal. Registered reports are a different take on this publishing process, where the authors design a study and then submit that design and methods for peer review at a journal before any data is collected. So the reviewers will provide input and decide if they will accept the study in principle, essentially. If it's accepted, then the researchers go and collect the data and submit the results to that same journal.
That's
as
amazing.
As long as they adhere to that protocol, the reviewers have to accept the study regardless of what they found. So that's the really cool part, is that there's not going to be you have to accept null or negative findings.
Yeah, no publication bias then.
Exactly. So I think it has a lot of benefits. For the authors, you really don't have to worry if you're going to find statistically significant or novel findings. They just do the research like they planned, and then it will get published as long as they adhere to their protocol. For editors and reviewers, they get to provide input before data is collected and resolve any flaws in the design. You're not getting something as this nice, neat package and recognizing, oh, I wish that they hadn't done X, Y, and Z. So then I think also for science as a whole, it makes research more transparent and reproducible. Like you said, there's not going to be that element, or hopefully reduces that element of publication bias. So the ASHA journal has actually recently adopted this approach. So I'm really excited to see kind of how our field uses it. I haven't seen one published yet, but it was just offered a few months ago. So there's still time.
Great.
Okay, so Julia mentioned your paper that is about to get published soon about the survey that you completed. What did you and your colleagues do, and what did you find out?
Yeah, so this project was a collaboration with a group of early career researchers in CSD that included Miriam Elamine, Helen Long, Mary Alice Keller, and Elaine Kearney. So shout out to them, really great group of scientists. It's a pleasure to work with. The goal of the study really was to survey researchers in the field of communication sciences and disorders to understand their self-reported knowledge, implementation, and perceived barriers and benefits of these open science practices. So we sent out a survey and had 222 researchers in the United States respond, mostly assistant professors and doctoral students. And we found that there was generally low knowledge of open science practices, most notably actually for pre-registration. And implementation was quite low, with less than 25% of scientists using at least one open science practice in their research. Personally, though, I thought the most interesting finding was the perceived barriers to implementation. There were a lot of common misconceptions and concerns that I think are great to address. Hopefully we address them in the paper, but also as a field, I think we need to kind of have better knowledge of what these practices are so we can understand when it's appropriate to use them for different designs, et cetera. So one example we kind of already touched on is pre-registration. A lot of researchers were concerned that they wouldn't be able to change aspects of their study once it was pre-registered, which, like we said, really isn't true. There was also confusion about what constitutes a pre-registration. A lot of people said, well, yeah, I pre-register, I upload a protocol to my website, or I submit it through the IRB. And so that's pre-registered because I submitted something to IRB. When actually you probably need to submit it to a third-party registry that can kind of maintain it, such as the Open Science Framework. And they really provide, they make it public, and they also make it shareable and time-stamped. So those are key components where it's public, it's not going to leave, and it's also you're gonna know when they actually uploaded it, so that you can kind of assess these different things. So I think overall we found that these findings really highlight that there's a need for support for researchers at the university level, the department level, and also from journals to kind of improve our access and knowledge to implement these practices. We can't expect researchers to do this completely on their own. There has to be community support and even institutional incentives in place if we want this to grow.
And do you have any ideas on how this could work or what this support should look like?
Yeah, I think that the CS Disseminate group is one kind of volunteer-based group that can provide resources kind of outside institutions, which I think is nice, and also across different subfields in speech pathology and audiology. But yeah, I think it's just acknowledging at the institutional level that these things can matter, and maybe they should be a component of tenure in evaluating a candidate if you're doing some of these practices, because they're valuable tools. And I think that they just show, like I've said before, that you're being highly transparent in your research process.
So you've already mentioned CS Disseminate, and you're one of the collaborators of this group. And as far as we are aware, you are the only dysphagia expert on the team. Could you maybe explain what CS Disseminate is and what you do and what your aims are?
Yeah, so it's a grassroots organization led by volunteer researchers and clinicians in speech pathology and audiology, whose goal is really at its core to make research more accessible. To date, the group has really focused on how to educate researchers on self-archiving or green open access, like we talked about before, so that clinicians without access can download free, up-to-date research. I think there are goals in the future to provide education on open data and other aspects of open science as well, but they really started with self-archiving. So hopefully it can grow and be a resource where researchers can go to kind of get started with this. In terms of my role, I collaborate with the group and help with initiatives when I can. There's a lot of great people behind the scenes who volunteer so much of their time to help. And yeah, if you want to read more about it, you can go to csdisseminate.com.
We will link it in the show notes, definitely.
Perfect.
So you've talked about all the core practices. What about yourself? How do you personally implement open science?
Yeah, like I mentioned before, I think it really depends on the nature of the project. In terms of sharing data and analysis scripts, I've been involved in some systematic reviews, and then this latest survey study where we really made a concerted effort to share all aspects of the data and code. So that was really a great learning experience and a great way to be really transparent and hopefully help things move forward a little faster. In terms of pre-registration, I've only pre-registered one study, which was the survey study. And that was a really, really great experience. It forced us to really think through and document our aims, hypotheses, operational definitions, and statistics before we jumped into data collection. And when we finally performed the analysis and wrote up the paper a few months later, we had this great time-stamped, comprehensive document, and even had all of the code filled out beforehand, which made it much faster and probably more accurate to go through and write up the manuscript.
Yeah, great. Is there anything else that you would like to add? Anything that we forgot to talk about?
No, I think we covered a lot. I guess my biggest advice, again, recognizing that this is coming from someone that has not personally done a lot of open science in my work, but certainly striving to do more when it's appropriate. I think it can be overwhelming at first because there are so many options and people feel like they have to do it all at the beginning. But really, I think you can just try one thing at a time and see how it goes. And maybe you pre-register in the sense that you write everything out, but you don't want to make it public for that project. Still, that's a great tool that we probably all should be doing in our research process. And there's also a lot of great websites, and other fields have grappled with these problems. We're in a great position in that the tools are out there. So the Open Science Framework is a really, really great resource. They provide their templates. Everything is 100% free. The interface is really clean. So I definitely recommend that. The other thing I found helpful, honestly, is trying to find other people in speech pathology or audiology that are using these open science practices. Even if they're in adjacent fields like voice, aphasia, or language, just seeing how they're doing it and incorporating it into their studies, and what they're making available, how they're grappling with privacy questions. Those are really easy ways to kind of lean on people that have been trailblazers and have been doing it kind of earlier than us. So can certainly be a lot to deal with, but I think that just being open to it and recognizing that, like I said before, it's not an indicator of quality. It's an indicator of transparency. So yeah, I think that's it.
Okay, thank you so much for taking the time and for coming on our podcast. We hope that you, our listeners, enjoyed this episode as well. If you would like to get in touch with us and stay informed about upcoming episodes, you can follow us on Instagram at Dysphagia Matters, on Twitter at DysphagiaPcast, or visit our website dysphagiamatters.org. Thanks so much for listening. Thank you, James, for coming, and take care, everyone.